Hey everyone, this is Sina with another episode of Into the Bytecode. My guest today is Vitalik Buterin, his third time on the podcast. So this is a conversation about politics and political ideologies. We talk about the transition from the 20th century to the 21st century and what the political ideologies that are coherent with this new world look like. And we look to the future and talk about the main dimensions of uncertainty as we think about how things can develop from here. I hope you enjoy. I thought we could spend the time today talking about politics and political ideologies more specifically. And I know this is something you've been thinking about for a long time and kind of diving into more deeply recently. And maybe as a way to kind of ground the conversation and why this is something that is worth thinking about at all today. I feel like there's a sense in which from reading your writing, I get the sense that there's kind of a first principles way in which the political ideologies of the past don't translate into the modern world as well as we've kind of moved to the internet, to these kind of like more global public goods. There's a bunch of things that, that are relatively new in the world and are going to only get kind of more accentuated going forward. And then I also feel like you kind of point out specific ways in which existing political ideologies are kind of failing us or are falling out of popularity, right? With, say, Miami banning lab-grown meat, even though they're supposed to be a, libertarian, individual rights type of state. So with that as a preamble, I'm curious how you would characterize like where we are today, why this is a problem that's worth focusing on today and thinking about.
So I think I could give two answers. One of them is a crypto specific answer, since we are crypto people, and like that's I think the entryway into this for a lot of the audience too. And the second is a big picture general answer. So the crypto specific answer is that I think first of all the reason why we all got into the space, right? It does fundamentally have to do with all of these ideals about how the economy and society could work better, right? Trying to create a more free and open financial system as opposed to one where big banks get bailed out and nobody else does. Trying to create something where individuals can have more privacy, but at the same time, the rules of the system and the way that the most powerful things work can actually be made more open and more accessible and readable and understandable by anyone. The very international nature of the crypto economy and the way that the technology allows people to be in this space together with each other and economically and culturally interact with each other without any regard for borders. And I think all of these ideals and more, right? Bring in the entire free and open source software movement are the reasons that initially attracted us to this whole space. And at the same time, I think political ideologies have a lot of relevance to how things can be done inside of crypto as well, right? I think one of the biggest differences that I've noticed between ideologies that are very modern and very internet native versus ideologies in the 20th century, and there are many differences, but just zero in on one of them, is that ideologies of the 20th century tended to be focused on what the government should do, right? They focused on should the government respect property rights, or should the government impose heavy regulations and taxes, or should the government just own everything? Should the government value economic freedom? Should it value economic equality? What kinds of ways should it guarantee civil rights? And so on and so forth, right? and ideologies in the 21st century. And I think when I say 21st century, I'm going to put on a bit of a historian's hat where we're going to say the 21st century began around 2020 to 2023, in basically the same way that the 20th century began between 1911 to 1918, and I know the 19th began in 1789. But ideologies of the 21st century, right? If you think about like something like EAC, for example, right? These are ideologies. Just to give another example, even Glenn's plurality movement, Balaji's network states, just crypto itself. They're ideologies that speak primarily not even to the government, often at least partially to governments, though often they explicitly recognize that governments exist in the plural. But they also speak to corporations, they speak to entrepreneurs, they speak to intellectuals, they speak to cultural actors, they speak to programmers, independent software developers, even musicians, pretty much everyone, right? And this, to me, is an example of a thesis that I, in one of my posts a few years ago, I think this is like one of my end notes on 2020, I think, I called it the dense jungle. And the dense jungle thesis is basically this idea that big X is here to stay for all X, right? By which we mean big government and big business, and also big protest mob and big cryptography, and like big anything for like any X, regardless of whether you like that particular thing or not. The observation I had there is basically that if you take any of the political perspectives that existed about 20 years ago, you might notice that if you define success by the absence of a thing that you don't like, then you probably feel frustrated. If you define yourself by being anarchist, you feel frustrated. If you define yourself by being anti-inequality, you feel frustrated, and so on and so forth, right? But if you define success by the presence of a thing, then, we all friggin' won, right? We have all of these really advanced cryptographic technologies. We have this highly international economy where if you want to, you can go be a digital nomad, and it's easier than ever to become independent of any one specific country. And there's a lot of these new methods of cooperation that are like much more distributed and non-corporate at the same time. Open source is very powerful, and so on, right? And the dense jungle thesis basically says that the whole point of the 21st century, as a result of the rapid growth of communication, information technology, is that all of these forces are simultaneously supercharged. Like every form of coordination and whether we like it or we don't like it, is more powerful than ever before. And all of these different forces are basically forced to contend with each other in this arena that at the same time has not grown at all, right? And so think about it as being like the difference between, like imagine like Hunger Games with 24 rats inside of the Roman Colosseum. And then imagine if over the course of the game, the rats grow and they turn into 24 elephants that are in the size of the same Colosseum, right? This is the fundamental condition of these superorganisms in the 21st century. So closing that bracket a bit, right? So in the context of this dense jungle thesis, you just have all of these powerful superorganisms that are powerful in different ways, and modern ideologies really speak to all of them, right? And one of those actors is the crypto space itself, right? And one of the interesting things about the crypto space is that it has lots of governance happening, including formal, including informal, including everything, right? Like I recently made this post where I reviewed the two books on the block size war, right? There was Jonathan Beer's The Block Size War, and then Roger Ver's Hijacking Bitcoin. And I think one of the reasons I care about this, right, is because like they might be some of the very earliest like real books of post-internet history. And what I mean by the word real here is like history is like at its most real when you have these like deep conflicts that feel existential to their participants, right? And people don't get like animated and excited by like the history of changes in grain prices between 1868 and 1892, right? It's like the big stuff. And these wars that happened in Bitcoin, I think the reason why they're meaningful, right, is because they just happened right at this era where virtual worlds finally became big enough and powerful enough that there's just this really huge critical mass of economic value that was in them. And on top of that, they were immersive enough that people's lives and people's emotional energy was all sunk into them. And all of these things were kind of true in the 2000s. If you think about like Second Life and World of Warcraft and EVE Online. And I remember reading articles about like $25,000 ships that got blown up. And like that was a really big deal, right? But now, you have like $150 million being stolen from a DAO. And like Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, when they forked, they were like multi-billion-dollar chains, right? And the reason why I care about this is that I think when you start to read books of internet history, and then you start to compare that with the knowledge that we have about like regular, the history that we learned in school in the best case, or the history that you learned from podcasts in the, podcasts have a very wide distribution of quality, of course, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, some of them definitely tell you very wrong things about World War II that you should definitely not listen to. But I think hardcore history, on the other hand, is great. And you get to see these different sides, and you get to ask, like, what are the real human universals, right? And, what are the things that are these very deep and enduring traits of a combination of human psychology and just inherent properties of like game theory and interaction of multiple people and multiple tribes that are so robust that they survive across media as different as, wars between countries and conflicts within a blockchain on the internet. And I think there's like things that you can find, right? Even like patterns such as, for example, how Bitcoin people, would accuse Ethereum people of intervening in this civil war and, supporting the side of Bitcoin Cash, which a lot of Ethereum people, did, because like a lot of the reason why people went to Ethereum is because, they believed in, blockchains that like technologically progress more, right? And then you compare that to like conflicts between countries where it's like pretty common to accuse like whoever your opponent is of like foreign interference and supporting some local rebel movement that you don't like, right? And of course, the psychological reason why you do this is because if the frame is just your government versus the rebel movements, then it looks like you're the Goliath liking the David. And, you're kind of on the narrative back foot there. But if, on the other hand, you can re-portray the David as being the pawn of an even bigger Goliath outside, then like that kind of, like that flips the narrative, right? And, these are things that we see in like these like totally incredibly different media, right? So like even things like that, they happen in crypto, right? And then at the same time, we have more regular things, like we have hard forks in Ethereum. Then you have DAOs that are on top of Ethereum. You have projects that are forking in all kinds of different ways. You have projects that are competing with each other, projects that are cooperating. There's all kinds of these like very rich and very complicated relationships. And I think a lot of the political philosophy has a lot of very meaningful things to say about those kinds of topics. So that's the crypto part of the answer, right? Which is basically that I think, social and political ideals are what got a lot of us into crypto. And at the same time, I think like those ideas and newer versions of them have a lot to teach us in terms of how this space and things in this space should keep moving. But maybe we'll pause here before getting into big picture stuff.
Yeah, that resonance between crypto and the broader world is a really interesting one. And yeah, the idea of the Bitcoin block size war as one of the first real events of internet native history is a really good one. Um, let's get into the broader picture. What's the kind of more
Hmm.
geopolitical
Hmm.
physical world version of why this is a problem that matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where we get back to the dense jungle thesis, right? Big X is here to stay for all X. Um, and I think this is a really interesting period in history because there's a lot of old things that are falling away, and there's a lot of new things that are coming in at the same time. And this is not the first time that something like this has happened, right? Like a famous quote about World War One is basically that people went into the war on top of horses that came out inside of tanks, and like that is a real technological change that happened inside of the span of literally like less than 4 years, right? I think the tanks even started a bit in 1917. And the psychological impact that had was profound, and like it really felt to people like this big shift from a pre-modern world going into a modern one. And I feel like the time period of about 2020 to 2023 was a similar shift in terms of going from the 20th century to the 21st century. So if we think about some of the major events that happened, right? So one of them is, of course, COVID. And COVID, it was a major pandemic. It was a major event that the entire world went through at the same time, and where the entire world was really in sync in a way that was not really true previously, right? I mean, World War II, you could say, yeah, the whole world was like kind of in sync, but even there, not really. And it was also this transition from analog to digital, right? There were a lot of these step function changes that really happened, and a lot of people learned a lot of like more digital ways of living and really haven't gone back. Then, in a lot of ways, it was also the triumph of technology in the sense of the COVID vaccine, right? And there's a lot of evidence that it basically ended up saving millions of lives. Okay, I'm going to get canceled from the Bitcoin Maximalist podcasts. Hopefully, not all of them.
Yep.
But and like that's interesting, right? Because the entire 20th second half of the 20th century, like to me, it was really characterized by this kind of post World War II, post 1960s techno pessimism, right? Where like there's this strong dominant vibe of technology is something that by default can only interfere with and harm the world, and we need to go back to simpler ways of living and go back to nature if we want to be healthier. And that's a sentiment that's still strong, right? But at the same time, this shift to artificialness as being this lifesaver was, I think, one of those like really big like century pivots. So those are a couple of the consequences of COVID, and obviously, I think there were a lot. So another one is that I think the idea of freedom is one that it easily goes off the rails if it becomes too abstract and ideological for people, right? And it feels like every new generation basically has to have a new example to rally around and relate to. And the I think the lockdowns like were this like a very big memory like that for many people, and I think it's important for everyone listening to remember, right, that there's definitely some parts of the world where lockdowns were quite minor, and other parts where they were like incredibly severe, right? And then you had the entire spectrum, and on top of that, also censorship, right? The whole debate of should experts sort of control the parameters of the public discussion as a result of already coming up with the correct conclusion in the context of some expert discussion that they had in private. And I mean, we actually did see the experts being very wrong in a bunch of important cases, right? I mean, to be clear, the anti-experts were like crazy wrong in lots of cases too, right? But even like the WHO has a tweet that's like still up that says COVID is not airborne, right? And there's a long, complicated story around that, right? But like that really ended up like screwing up the process quite a bit, right? And like these are generational memories. And then, of course, I think COVID, the pandemic never ended, but in 2022, of course, things also shifted again with the start of a major war. And then in 2023, of course, there was another war on top of that it has some very different connotations and like a very different situation to it as well. So it's like these are all things that really shape the public consciousness in pretty deep ways, and they all happened like at the same time. And these are kind of negatives, right? These are kind of big cataclysmic events that just like shock people. If you look at technology, and then in addition to digitization, one of the big ones that we saw was like, I think this one is important for people to meditate on. AIs are passing the Turing test. Like, remember, when you were growing up, we were all taught that the Turing test is the marker for, okay, these AIs are not a toy anymore. This is like serious shit happening. They are within range of what might be called human level, right? And like the modern like top level AIs now are at the level of quality where like if you set up an actual formal experiment, then a lot of the time they totally can fool people into thinking that they actually are people, right? And that's something that I feel like society has still not fully updated on, right? And I think that shift happened around 2023 or so. And that happened without really people paying that much attention to it, right? But at the same time, it's like a really profound thing, right? I think one of the other things that really defines the end of the 20th century is this sense of technological stagnation, right? And you have entire movements like progress studies that basically formed at that time that were all about trying to get out of it. And then now we have like the exact opposite of stagnation. I think it's pretty obvious that this era that we're in is the last era before the era of some kind of superhuman intelligence. Now we have no idea whether that era is going to be 5 years or 50 years or 100 plus, right? But we are in the last era, and that's something that I think is worth taking really seriously. So yeah, again, lot of and
so
I mean, I feel like this gets into the weeds a lot, right? But the point is that like so many different things about the world have fundamentally changed. That the world has moved from being offline first to being online first. A lot of like tribes have become really heavily reorganized. A lot of people are kind of feeling at a loss in various ways, like especially politically, not knowing where to go. And so I think there's this great value in trying to like actually find, what are the new ideas that really will appeal to people and like bring about the kind of world that we want to see. And I think this is like one of those really valuable projects to be thinking about.
Into the Bytecode is sponsored by Splits. Are you tired of sacrificing security for usability? Splits believes it's still way too hard for teams to self-custody their on-chain assets. They're building a new kind of internet-native bank on top of Ethereum. Splits makes it easy for teams to manage the whole lifecycle of their finances, from structuring revenue sharing agreements using payment flows like splits and waterfalls, to managing those earnings once you receive them, using passkeys and smart accounts. Splits is being used by teams like Protocol Guild, Zora, Songcamp, and others. I'm a big believer in them and recommend checking them out. You can learn more at splits.org. Yeah, there's a way in which it feels like, the previous era has just ended, and we've all been reawakened to the importance of these questions when it comes to our personal freedoms, like with very visceral examples that we've lived through. And there's so many changes on, the world becoming more globalized and synchronized with technology moving forward. Like all the kind of parameters of life are shifting in very meaningful ways. Looking and also thinking of this as possibly the last era before we have superintelligence really kind of dials up the urgency and importance of thinking about how are we coordinating, how are we decision making, how do we kind of like enter this next era, because it's a very important one. And so maybe thinking about now what this next, what the contours of this next phase of, human coordination, coexistence, decision making, all of this stuff could look like. And one of the pieces that you've kind of linked to, and I thought was really interesting, was Glenn's piece on the kind of 3 political ideologies for the 21st century that they flesh out further in the plurality book. And the kind of underlying premise of that is that kind of political ideologies and technology kind of like are a dependent pair. Like they kind of like go together. And in this era where we have kind of AI passing the Turing test, there's a version of the world that could lead into that's kind of different than different like kind of forks that we could go down. So I'm curious how you would think about like if we were to think of parallel universes over the next 5 to 50 years. What are different versions of the world that we could live in? What are what are political ideologies that have coherent kind of inner logics that could be stable with the worlds that we're entering into?
So I think there's a couple of major dimensions of uncertainty, right? So one of them is, of course, the rate of AI progress, right? Because, there are people who seriously believe that we are literally on 4-year timelines away from superintelligence. I personally, think that that's probably false, but, there definitely are people who seriously, think this way. And if that's true, then like everything goes out the window, right? And like, I feel like I've always sort of known this in the back of my head. Like I remember, being in high school and, during the daytime, I would go into a geography class and they'd be telling me about demographic projections and, what's going to happen in China in the 2090s and, the need to have certain family planning policies or not. And then, the evening I'll be reading Ray Kurzweil talking about the singularity being imminent. And it's like, dude, like if that stuff's going to happen, then like we don't freaking know what's going to be the case in the 2090s. It's like, what do you mean the population of China is going to be somewhere between like 0.95 and 1.05 billion? It's like, no. I mean, we don't even know it's going to be above 100 million. We don't know it's going to be below 100 billion, right?
Right. It's like the classic case of using past data to model the world and not realizing that the model itself has like very deep uncertainty.
Yes. So I think technological uncertainty is one of those big axes. The other big axis to watch is the level of conflict in the world. And the level of conflict has increased massively in the last 10 years. and that has like very direct human costs, right? I visited Ukraine myself, a couple of months ago, and I could go around the streets, and you can definitely see people walking around with signs of some pretty crazy injuries, right? And that's like a direct human cost that's like very bad for people, right? And this is going to affect society, how like children think and grow up, and all of this, right? And so conflict always has these like very direct, very bad costs. It also has indirect effects, right? And the one example of this is that one of the ways that I think about like Silicon Valley ideology in about let's say around 2010 is that I think people then like basically thought that they were creating the kind of stuff that we think we're creating when we're creating decentralized software, except they and the users and like basically the world assumed that all of these control related properties don't really matter, and the reason basically is because the world was at peace, right? And the world was like at peace in multiple meta levels, right? Like the US and China had very good relations compared to today, but also like for example, you did not have like major venture capital funds just explicitly labeling like large portions of American elite society as the enemy. And on the flip side, you did not have like large chunks of American elite society openly calling for censorship. And so no one was like, the extent to which people were trying to exert power over each other, both on the physical level and on the virtual, was much lower. And I think this is also a big part of why Silicon Valley was able to scale so successfully, right? Which is basically that the whole issue of power and control was in the background, and so people did not really mind that all of this American technology was just taking over worldwide. And that definitely did change over time. Like from my time in China, I've definitely heard, like at least once that actually the Snowden revelations, really turned on a lot of people's minds, right? Like the side of that whole situation that has like gets discussed a lot is of course the Chinese government wanting control, which is like very real. The other side is the Chinese government not wanting to be controlled by the United States, right? And that's and like this growing use of technology as a lever of control, and like as a lever of creating vulnerability that you can or dependency that you can then exploit is something that really rose up over time, right? And at the same time, that has this like two-way feeding effect between other kinds of conflict, right? Because if two countries both think that the other is going to blow them up, then like they're not going to be in a mood to be super open to accepting like freedom of speech or even like freedom of tech platform competition across both of those countries, right? But and that at the same time, like this kind of technological trade war and is something that can also actually like escalate these moods of hostility, right? And we've seen hostility go up by quite a bit, and that ends up affecting a lot of these trends, right? And like ultimately, we talk about like crypto, for example, as a trust technology, right? And ask like what is the enduring advantage that actually makes it possible for it to work internationally when so many other financial systems don't, right? And like that friction doesn't just exist because like programmers in banks are stupid, right? Like that friction exists for a bunch of reasons, but like a big one is definitely like limitations in the extent to which jurisdictions trust each other. And so that kind of stuff I expect will continue to increase, right? And so the question is now like, where do things go from here, right? And like and yet I'm sure you've listened to like stuff I've said and stuff I've written. I'm not one of these people that will ever give a bombastic claim of oh, World War III is going to happen, or like no, this the world is becoming normal now. Calm down, relax. Like I always see a range of possible futures, and actually, it's like on the one hand that kind of sounds like a very sort of like weak man kind of beta thing to say, right? But on the other hand, it's like if you actually express that position on prediction markets versus expressing the kind of Chad like I am certain position. It's like sorry, but the beta man is going to be
higher expected value.
The landlord renting the Chad their house in 10 years. I mean, there are exceptions, right? So, like, for example, there are people willing to bet that there's like a 4% chance of a civil war in the UK this year. And so I ended up putting a little bit on the other side of the bet. And that for that one, it was just like a matter of basic math, right? It's like if you think there's a 4% chance of a civil war in about 40% of a year, that means you think there's a 100% chance of a civil war in 10 years, and that's just crazy. But in general, I think like markets are good because they give you that accountability and they make you realize that, like, well, actually, if you are the beta male and you recognize the uncertainty in the world and you don't try to kind of chat your way through it with bombastic statements, then like ultimately that's the more correct perspective. So I see a range of possible futures in terms of how conflicty the world is going to get, right? And I think there definitely is a possibility that people have kind of had enough of this in the early 2020s, and things are actually going to be more peaceful going forward. And there's also the possibility that for like whatever reasons, possibly even surprises, that things will keep getting worse, right? And this there's a whole range of possibilities, because I think if you think about some of the plurality ideas, especially if you think about some of the very large scale ones, right? There's definitely a certain idealism to like wanting to create and deploy large scale mechanisms based on principles that try to benefit all of humanity. And that kind of stuff generally happens if there is goodwill and if there is a mood of like people being tired of fighting, right? So, UN founded when people were tired of World War II. A lot of the ideas of modern liberalism, they were founded when people got sick and tired of things like the 30 Years' War in Europe in the 17th century, and so on and so forth, right? And if things go in that positive direction, then the question is like, how do we really best harvest that and like really put humanity in a strong position to create the kind of world that we want to see and be well suited to handle these technological challenges? And I think a lot of the plurality ideas are potentially very well designed for that, right? But then on the flip side, if the world becomes this more hostile and more unforgiving place, then like idealism is not the thing that defines institutions, right? I think, or the thing that happens is basically you have a couple of large players, you have a lot of people that huddle around the large players for safety, and you have people whose strategy is to stay neutral and essentially be some kind of whether you call it counterculture, whether you call it non-aligned movements, whether you call it decentralized movements or whatever else. And I think there's definitely value in like crypto, both as a technology and as a community, in trying to just create something that keeps working across the world, even at a time when more and more other things are going to start fraying. And there's value in crypto as a community actually continuing to maintain some of those links and connections, right? Like one of my favorite things about the ICO era back from 2016 to 2018 is how projects will just naturally by default get these very international communities, right? You just start a sale and it's just in your interests to raise as much as possible. And so you're just going to do the work to have a community in the US and a community in Europe and a community in China and a community in Japan and so forth, right? And like the project would take all these very diverse people and tie them together, right? And in modern times, unfortunately, there's this like shift toward insider investment. And I think, that has a lot of downsides, but one of those downsides is definitely that like it's basically a group of like 10 or 20 people that all talk to each other, right? So that's so like it's not really connecting people who would otherwise not be connected, right? And like the plurality idea that like I really try to emphasize a lot in my review is the idea that like we really wants to focus on connecting people who would otherwise not be connected, right? It's the pairwise like matching, correlation discounts, match bridging bonuses is the term that Pooja likes to use, and so on, right? And it's like that kind of function that I think crypto as a space can play, like both sociologically and technologically. So that's. But then at the same time, I think we do have to be mindful of the possibility that if things go very bad, like people are going to have way bigger problems than anything that digital coins and digital records can solve, right? And so I think this is one of those reasons why like I keep like putting a lot of money into the bio space, for example, right? So like at the beginning, I put a lot of money into longevity because it just seemed like an obviously super undervalued sector, and I think it's still super important, though it's definitely less neglected than before. Also, with the Balvi and Conroe efforts, like I've been focusing some on like airborne disease resistance and resilience, and that's also one of those like downside protection things that's going to be very important and could end up being very, very important. But yeah, like there's definitely a level to this where like crypto at best only helps a little bit, right? And it's important to be mindful of that. And then also on the positive side, I think like the value of crypto is basically that it becomes this kind of laboratory for all kinds of really fascinating social mechanisms and things that begin in crypto. Like it just becomes this really effective generator where if it survives here, then it can just succeed and prosper anywhere, right? And things like crypto social apps like Lens and Farcaster, I think they are becoming really showing their lasting value, right? And like definitely not like hyper growing in terms of users yet, but I think like lasting is a type of value in itself. And like something like Polymarket is something that is being cited by mainstream political intellectuals. Like even the types of people that would normally just casually say like, oh yeah, crypto is useless, like they retweet screenshots of Polymarket, right? And like there's a lot of people who quietly use Polymarket basically as a news site, right? Because like one of the sort of black pill things about news, right, is that it's often not just telling you what happened, it's also telling you how you should feel about what happened. And that second part, because it's so subliminal, it's like so easy for it to be incredibly misleading. It's like a very adversarial environment, right? And prediction markets, the one piece of the puzzle that they solve is that basically if you see that something that's happened, you can just like quickly open up Polymarket and you can see in 5 seconds, is this a big deal or is it a non-event? And if it's a non-event, then you stop caring and then you like flip over to looking at the next cat meme, right? But if the markets tell you it's a big deal, then like that's a signal, right? And that tells you it's worth actually spending your attention to understand like what's actually going on here, right? Which there's always some chance that it's still manipulation, but like at least it gives you that signal where you can go and check. So these are like examples of this kind of like even peacetime value that like crypto as a technology can provide, right? And decentralized social, and I think to me it's like the extension of the spirit of open source to these large scale collaborative platforms, right? Because the thing that Farcaster gives you is like, and Lens at the same also, right, is that they create this network where anyone can build a client that creates their own view to the network, right? And so like it really solves these monopoly problems, right? Because if one client has some property you don't like, then you could just go and start your own client, right? And you can go and create your own clients. You can have your own rules. You can have your own content, like prioritization and filtering algorithms, and you don't have to start from scratch because you're creating a window to the same content, and so you're sharing the same network effects, right? And then, within the context of finance, right, there's definitely, even now, a lot of international financial operations that crypto, like even today, is just quietly making easier for a lot of people. And like this stuff is not advertised, right? Like it often doesn't show, like the reason why crypto remittance startups tends to fail is because you don't need a freaking remittance startup to do remittance. It's like, no, you just like buy the coins at an exchange, you just move them, and then you like sell them at the other exchange, right? Like the whole point of this space is that it's a DIY sector. And so of course, DIY activity is not going to show up in the statistics in the same way, right? And there's just like all kinds of people who have quietly discovered ways by which it makes it their lives much easier to be able to just like hold and move money in some ways, right? And there are ways in which crypto is valuable only in time of conflict, right? Like the countries in which it gets the highest adoption are realistically countries where the existing financial system or systems are the weakest. But at the same time, there are other applications of crypto that like actually only really work well if you have at least like some basic rule of law somewhere, right? So like real world assets, for example, right? Like if you don't have rule of law anywhere, then you're not going to be able to have any kind of crypto dollar except for the kind of fully decentralized Derive version, and that's that has limits to its capital efficiency, right? And so, I mean, maybe, the synthesis of both of those two, right, is basically that crypto can be a way to allow, like countries, companies, and environments anywhere in the world that do have stability to basically be able to like really leverage and project that stability into the rest of the world and allow other people to benefit from it. So like there's interactions between like types of technology and degree of conflict in the world. And in terms of other axes of uncertainty, I mean, one of them is just like how effectively the crypto space itself is able to really deliver on its core ideals and at the same time really scale to the next stage of users, right? Because to me, crypto today is in this interesting predicament where there are successful crypto applications, but they often end up compromising on the decentralization, right? It's like, USDC, and a lot of it happens inside of Binance accounts or on Tron. And then on the flip side of it, you have, poor Lefterist who just keeps working hard on building Broadkey as this like fully open source like self-custody accounting software, and he just like gets a hard time even like getting the donations to support himself, right? So definitely encourage people to support him in those kinds of projects where we can, right? But there definitely is this phenomenon where like there's this stuff that succeeds, but the stuff that succeeds ends up being kind of a little far away from the values that we came into the space for. I mean, so one example is like the finance, like stablecoin transfer stuff. I mean, another example, of course, is like all of these, like pump.fund, sun.pump, like whatever things, right? And they're, like there's, I definitely feel, like why a lot of people have this kind of mood of nihilism as a result of that. Though I think this is one space where like crypto in particular should not beat itself up too hard, right? Because like I definitely see nihilism in Twitter outside of crypto too, right? Like if you just look at the kind of stuff that's spreading, like outside of crypto, like there's definitely, yeah. There's definitely, yeah, like some, quite a bit of crazy and dark stuff. There is, the usual election season stuff. Like, there's definitely, yeah, a feeling of, kind of missing hope, and that. So, I think this is a problem that crypto needs to work through, but really, yeah, it's very far from being exclusive to crypto itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like this is the duality that we're in, right? Basically, that there are things that are idealistic and only a little bit successful, and then there are things that are successful but very not idealistic. And like the big unlock is going to be if we can figure out a way to be very successful and very idealistic at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are rays of hope here, right? So one example of this, right, is let's like zero in specifically on the question of if you have a crypto app, like something like Crypto Social, then how do you log into it, right? The pure answer is, well, you log into it with an Ethereum wallet. The problem is that this sucks for adoption because now if you're getting someone on board, you have to not just get them to download your app, you have to also get them to download this other app. And that other app also did talk about setting up a 12-word seed phrase. And then there's all of these unfamiliar concepts to just multiply on top of each other. But then the other approach that people did a couple of years ago is like what they call social login, right? Which is like a phrase that I totally hate because no, being social is a fundamental part of being human, and I will not let Web2 companies get to own the word social as some kind of trademark that refers to their centralized craft, right? Like that is a hill I will die on. But like what they mean by that is, of course, like crypto social apps where you can log in with your Google account, and it's like it solves the onboarding problem, but at the expense of just like burning everything that is beautiful and good about crypto. And so the question is like, what's the synthesis? And to me, the synthesis actually is account abstraction and ZK email, right? So here's what you do. If you create an app, then you can create an app where at the bottom level of the software, it's an app where you sign in with Ethereum and you're just doing everything with an Ethereum wallet. Now, what happens at one level higher than that? One level higher than that is if a user does not yet have an Ethereum wallet, then the app can automatically create an Ethereum for them using ZK email, right? You can just automatically generate an Ethereum address that is controlled by, or like I guess is recoverable by an email that is sent from your email address, right? And that's the flow that you can give to beginning users. And then what do you give to experienced users? Well, experienced users, if they have an Ethereum wallet, they could just link their Ethereum wallet directly. And if you do it this way, then one, you can serve both types of users, but two, you've created an open pathway for users to migrate from one to the other, right? Because once you've given someone a wallet, then they're going to be able to take that wallet and they're going to be able to migrate it into a real Ethereum wallet, and then they're going to be able to add their own recovery guardians if that's what they want to do, right? And I think like this is what we want to do, right? We want to like actually, like move people over from like the Web2 approach to the Web3 approach, and we want the Web3 approach itself to give people the full spectrum of options, right? So there's like full, like Bitcoin maximalist style, like 12 words engraved in titanium that's 19 feet underground. Like the maximalist feet, right? But and then the other approach is you have ZK email, and then there's like a whole bunch of approaches in the middle, right? Like you could have a 2 of 3 between a key that you control, a ZK email, and a ZK wrapper of your government ID, right? And and then if you're not American, then like that already gives you a redundancy, right? Because then you have your government ID that's from one jurisdiction, and then ZK email that's if you're using a Gmail account, Google is an American company, and so you just already have jurisdictional diversification, and you have like totally different tech stacks that are controlling those two recoveries, and so you already have this like very high level of robustness, right? And then you can add social recovery through your friends if you want. And you don't have to ask for their Ethereum addresses. You can also ask for their email addresses, and you can generate a ZK email address for them, and so on and so forth, right? So that's the path that I see, right? And to me, it's like if we can find like 10 or 20 things that are like that, and if we can really create applications that are both like mainstream friendly and that still have the openness and decentralization and permissionlessness properties that we really care about, then we can make something that's like really beautiful and interesting as an ecosystem. And we will be in a position to both really get a huge number of users and at the same time like actually be this really robust tech stack that actually will continue working for everyone even when other things don't. That to me is the upside, right? But the question is like, how successful are we actually going to be at executing on that kind of thing? And then like it's the same thing in every vertical, right? It's like, how successful are we going to be at actually creating a financial system that's like actually tied to and supporting some kind of real world economy, right? And like that doesn't necessarily have to mean RWAs that are backed by like things that are held at banks, right? Like if the next $1 trillion AI company becomes a DAO that is where shares are tradable in crypto, then like that's also a connection to the real world economy, right? But like you need some kind of ultimate tie to the real world economy, right? So I think that's another one of those variables. Then a third variable might be crypto's success in payments. Then a fourth variable might even be like how the whole privacy situation, both from a technology perspective and from a regulatory perspective, ends up playing out, and so on and so forth, right? So and I think basically to summarize, right, the two big dimensions of unknowns for me are like, one is what is going to be where is the dial of conflict in the world going to be set for the next few decades, and the second is to how are all of the different technologies going to progress, right? Well, that second dial, it's like actually many dials, right? Because like AI is separate from crypto, and both of those are separate from bio, and inside of bio there's like a whole bunch of different things that you can do, right? It's like you can focus on making civilization more pandemic resistant. You can focus on things like Neuralink. If Neuralink succeeds, then are we going to have BCIs that are open source and like formally verified, or are you going to have like a 0-day attack where a foreign adversary can like write into your mind? So it's I think there's many possible futures, and I think like we as a community have a lot to contribute on all of them. And I think getting back to plurality a bit, right? Like the core idea there basically is like, how do you take these animating ideals of having an open and democratic society and like actually concretely applying them to this condition of the 21st century where we are in the dense jungle, right? And I think I would love to see the crypto space being a testing ground of really making an earnest effort at trying these kinds of things out and using them to solve problems within the crypto space, and then progressing them further from there, and by doing so benefiting the wider world.
Well said. That's a great note to close on. Thanks so much again. Hey, I have a small ask here. If you've been listening to these conversations and want to support what we're doing here, I would really appreciate if you leave a rating and a review for the podcast. It might seem like a small thing, but it actually makes a big difference to help other people discover the show also. Thank you, and I'll see you again soon.